Good morning, and thank you for allowing me to present to you today on neurodegenerative disorder subtyping using Sleep EEG. As a shareholder in advanced brain monitoring, I would benefit financially if any of our intellectual properties were to be acquired by a third party. It is important to note that the majority of the work I'll be presenting today was funded by several National Institute of Aging grants that to date have totaled over $5 million. As a company, we've received grant funding mostly from NIH and the Department of Defense that is in excess of $40 million. First, let me introduce you to the Sleep Profiler. This is a product that's light, easy to apply by the patient, typically worn in their home. And this is what the signal patterns look like on a 10-minute screen. So first, we have the acoustic microphone that measures snoring. We use reflectance technology to measure pulse rate. Accelerometers measure head movement and head position. And we measure from AF7 to FPZ to pick up the left ocular activity, and AF8 to FPZ to measure the right ocular activity. And we measure the EEG from AF7 to AF8. Now, our product isn't unique in that one of the things we do, besides the auto scoring, is we mark the signals using a coloring scheme. So gray is wake, and then we go through darker stages of green as we go from N1 all the way to N3. The gold color is REM. And so here you can see on this 10-minute, this is all into sleep. We also identify spindles. They're typically very, very short duration in dark blue. And these are our cortical arousals that we mark in a lighter blue. So again, as you look across the patterns, you can see patterns that would suggest sleep disorder breathing, especially when you get cortical arousals, head movements, and changes in snoring. Now, what we do is we try and teach people to primarily stage initially looking at the signals on a 10-minute screen, because as I'll show you in a minute, the auto scoring is generally quite accurate, and then going into periods where it may require a look on a 30-second screen. So this example, what we see is a signal that is staged light into because there's a cortical arousal, but it also has a gray stripe indicating it might be awake. So if we go in and see that the wake period extends beyond 15 seconds, we would then go in and manually edit it. Now here's what the signals look like a little bit closer. This is on a 30-second screen. This is our spindle detector and marking all of the periods within the ranges or the areas that we find the spindle activity. And this is what the slow wave sleep looks like from the frontal region. The amplitude is a little bit less than what you might measure in a conventional PSG montage, in that plus or minus 60 microvolts is typically what we see in the frontal region using the differential recording compared to 75 microvolts by the conventional requirements. This is the differences you can see between N1 and REM sleep. And one of the things we do is we do a cross-correlation analysis that will take the slow activity and essentially remove it for purposes of distinguishing between something that is slow roller activity from something that leaves sharp edges that is REM activity. And finally, this is a signal on a 4-hour screen. And again, I'm trying to highlight the benefits and the differences of being able to see the power spectral characteristics and how they change as you go through the different stages of sleep. So starting out at the left edge, this black power is the EMG, and you can see that it drops down as the person goes into sleep onset, and then it stays pretty steady. There's a little bit of activity, and then there's some movement and awakening here, and then it drops back down again. During non-REM sleep, the signature is really about increased alpha and where the sigma power is elevated above both the beta and the EMG. And then you can see the transitions from non-REM to REM sleep where the beta power gets much, much greater and the sigma power is very, very low. So here you can see, again, the patterns going from non-REM to REM. There's a little bit of a longer transition to get into deep non-REM, an awakening, again, deep non-REM sleep, and REM again. So let me talk you through the accuracy. In order for our device to get cleared by the FDA, we recorded 47 patients who were studied simultaneously with polysomnography. 85% of them had suspected obstructive sleep apnea. And what we did was we took the PSG recordings and sent those to 5 RPSGTs, all from different institutions or facilities, and had each of them independently stage the sleep. Then we brought their staging back and established the gold standard being where if 3 of them or more agreed to the stage, that became the gold standard. And then we compared the sleep profiler after technical review to the gold standard to see how we agreed. And so as you can see, in all but N1 sleep, we got over 70%, 80% positive percent agreement compared to this majority. Now, it is important to note, embedded in this is the fact that the differences that technicians have, this kind of masks those results. So by way of example, N3 sleep is one of the more difficult stages to get consistent, reliable staging across technicians. And what we found in our study, when we looked at the percentage of all of the epochs across all 47 individuals, one technician staged 7.5% of all of those epochs N3 sleep, and another one staged over 28% N3 sleep. So that's the beauty of being able to use multiple raters in trying to validate the auto-staging technology. Now, in this study, what we did is we wanted to cross-validate how would the auto-staging with technical review do in patients with isolated REM sleep behavior disorder. We know these are going to be more difficult type cases because there's going to be EMG intrusion during REM sleep. So we ended up doing this in 2 sites where, again, we wore the sleep profiler simultaneous with PSG. At site 1, they had 16 patients. And this is the initial scoring agreement that you can see across the stages. And initially, we only were above 80% during wake and REM. At site 2, it was even worse, where we only were 80% agreement with stage N2 sleep. So what we did, we saw that the majority of disagreement came between N2 and N3. So we had both sites rescore or re-edit their data. At site 1, we identified those epochs where the PSG and the sleep profiler staging disagreed for them to go in and reevaluate their scoring. And you can see that the positive percent agreement increased substantially, especially during N3 sleep. They simply were calling too much N3 sleep. And then we hit the numbers that were very similar to our initial validation in these patients with isolated REM sleep behavior disorder. At site 2, we let them just blindly restage their scoring with the same technician. And here you can see that the positive percent agreement for stage N1 improved by twice, but was still below that magical 0.8 number. We also had lower REM agreement at site 2, and this is something that we're continuing to investigate because obviously as we go in to start looking at REM sleep without atonia, it's going to be very important that the sleep profiler detection of REM is similar to what you might detect during polysomnography. In this study, published back in 2018, we took 43 of those records that we had originally, I described, that we submitted to the FDA. And from the chin EMG, the submental EMG, we extracted the power during the stages that the PSG staged as wake, N1, N2, N3, and REM. And then we took the EMG power that is embedded in the EEG. So we're talking about taking a low-pass filter that is pulling all of the power information above 40 hertz and saying, what are those units of power on average do we get from the frontalis during the same epochs that were staged wake all the way through REM? And here's what we see. We can see that there's a 53% greater power during wake in the frontalis than we get from the submental EMG. And we also saw greater power during REM when EMG power is supposed to be suppressed as compared to the submental. So both of these were statistically significant. Now, looking at the frontalis EMG, one of the points here is that we originally received some question on how are we able to detect or recognize the posterior alpha that's so important for identifying sleep onset. And our response to that is because you can look at the EMG power and watch it decrease during sleep onset. So here it is that they're awake, and this is the black power that you see is kind of elevated. You see the sigma power starts coming up, and then it continues to drop down as they go into deeper non-REM sleep. So that was one of the reasons we published this study, is to be able to demonstrate the capability of the EMG power. Now, even more so, it's not just the power, but it's also the variability across all of the people and all of the epochs. So here, by way of example, I'm showing you that the average EMG power during wake across these 43 subjects was 875 units. However, the standard deviation around this value was well over that. So the coefficient of variation is 1.1. So essentially what we're saying here is the power was the standard deviation, the variability across all people far exceeded what we see, even though the power here during the frontal EMG is more elevated, it's also quite a bit less variable, 2 times less variable across all people during wake and N1 and N2 and N3. So all of these, the coefficient of variation is 2 times less. And then in REM, even though the actual power in the frontalis was significantly greater than submental, it was 4 times less variability, suggesting that this EMG power that we get from the frontal region is very, very reliable across people, and that the patterns are fairly consistent. Now let me introduce you to our neurodegenerative disorder biomarkers. The first one is sleep spindles. Sleep spindles have been around. Others have done work in this area. We developed an algorithm. Our automated detection of spindles are initiated or triggered by the detection of a spindle or a sigma peak, but we also require a concurrent alpha peak. And the point here is to develop an algorithm that can capture both slow and fast spindles, because as an initial pass through, what's important is to be able to detect the spindles and accurately characterize the length of the spindles. We also put thresholds in to minimize the amount of beta power that occurs during the peak region. This is to avoid the classification of spindles that are being influenced by certain medications, for example, as well as we require a very low value or low threshold for the EMG power. So again, what we do for spindle duration is we take the length of all these blue stripes over all of the periods during N2 and N3, and we sum them all up. And here you can see when we look at this spindle duration and we look across our Parkinson's spectrum disorder that includes progressive supranuclear palsy, dementia with Lewy bodies, REM sleep behavior disorder, and Parkinson's disease, they have significantly less spindle duration independent of age and sex as compared to our non-Parkinson's spectrum disorder groups that include Alzheimer's disease dementia, mild cognitive impairment, and normal controls. Now, it is interesting in that these spindles look very much like a trade effect. These are all of the different groups, including many that are in the neurodegenerative disorder groupings, and the night-to-night variability is very, very low. The intra-class correlations night-to-night on spindle duration is 0.995, so nearly perfect. Our next biomarker is what we call non-REM hypertonia. Now, this is a novel biomarker. It had not been reported before our paper that came out late in 2022 in the journal Sleep Medicine. And this, I'm going to first show you what the signals look like. So this is a signal during N3 sleep, and this is with non-REM hypertonia. This is without non-REM hypertonia. You can see the main difference visually is this signal just looks a little bit noisier, but overall the signal characteristics look quite similar. However, when we dissect the signal and look at the EMG power, you can see that it's 4 times greater than what we have during normal non-REM sleep. When we zoom out, here we're looking at a 1-hour time window. This is how we learned and discovered the characteristic, because the EMG power was going along, and then all of a sudden it elevated and stayed quite consistent. And here it elevated again, and then there's an awakening and it drops back down. And here it goes through the pattern again. And both of these non-REM hypertonia patterns occurred prior to REM sleep without atonia. It doesn't always happen that way, but this is an example where I'm also highlighting the fact you can see all of the ocular activity, you can see the chin EMG, and also you can see the EMG bursts that are occurring in the frontalis region. So this is the signal. We designed it so that it does automated detection. We do not recommend that it's edited. It looks for very, very low variability, and we look at the relationship between the theta power and the delta power to be outside acceptable ranges, and that's what we call the non-REM hypertonia. Now, we found this was discovered initially when we started looking at these patients with isolated REM sleep behavior disorder. We developed the algorithm, and then we went back and looked at some of our Parkinson's spectrum disorder groups, thinking that maybe it was associated with the alpha-synuclein group. And so we did find large amounts of percent time non-REM hypertonia in the DLB and the PD, but we also found it in the progressive supranuclear palsies that's a tauopathy. So we're not exactly sure of the mechanism of action, although we have a number of studies that are ongoing to try and better understand this. But again, you can see that the non-REM hypertonia was associated with those in the Parkinson's spectrum disorders, independent of age, sex, and SSRI and SNRI use, with really, really large odds. The night-to-night variability was a little bit greater than Spindle's, 0.78. But when we looked at the normal group, the controls, and we studied them a second time, anywhere from 364 all the way to 512 days, you can see that the longitudinal reliability of non-REM hypertonia is quite good. The last biomarker I'm going to present to you is what we call atypical N3 sleep. It's many times referred to as sepsis-associated encephalopathy or polymorphic delta activity. So I'm showing you these two signals. One of them is atypical N3 sleep, and the other one is normal N3 sleep. Now, we discovered this biomarker when we did a study at Mount Sinai a few years back, and we saw this pattern where patients were being, although they were mechanically ventilated, they were on or off medications, we saw these patterns of just a lot of what was getting auto-characterized as N3 sleep. And it didn't look quite right. So that was where we went back and looked at the research, identified with the sepsis-associated encephalopathy that appears to be associated with sepsis, obviously by the name. It also has been associated with delirium. In our study, we also found that the characteristics of the EEG signals with the atypical N3 sleep were also associated with mortality. So what are the difference between these two? We have the stage N3 is to the left, atypical N3 is to the right. A couple of key things that are different is when during the fast EEG, you would expect that the delta and theta power to be similar to each other. And across all of the N2 or N3 sleep, the theta power should be about 4 times greater than what we get for the alpha, sigma, beta, or EMG. During atypical N3 sleep, we have very, very elevated delta power and suppressed theta power. So it's suppressed during the fast. They're not equal to each other. The delta exceeds the theta, and the theta isn't consistently 4 times greater than the other signal patterns. I mentioned to you and showed you earlier how during non-REM sleep, we see that the sigma and the alpha power are elevated. And what we see during atypical N3 sleep is that all 4 of the alpha, sigma, beta, and EMG are much, much more mixed. So we used these characteristics and developed our automated detection of atypical N3 sleep. Now I'm going to go in and explain how we use these different biomarkers to characterize neurodegenerative disorder groupings. So just as a reminder, nomenclature, CG is our control group. We typically mark them in green. Isolated REM sleep behavior disorder, mild cognitive impairment, Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's disease, dementia with Lewy body, we've mixed with our Parkinson's disease dementia, and we have the progressive supranuclear palsy. For the next few slides, I will be using these initials primarily, and here are the sample sizes that were involved in this study. This has been submitted for peer review that's under review at the moment. So prior to that paper, this is separate of that, we previously had noticed and observed that we had hoped that what we detected as N3 sleep, especially in the Alzheimer's, because it had been previously reported to be suppressed N3 sleep in Alzheimer's compared to controls, we were hoping to be able to replicate that finding. We weren't. And one of the reasons is when we were looking at mean values, we had one of the AD patients that had over 85% of the night staged N3, and another one had over 65% of the night staged N3. So that triggered us to say, well, maybe it's not normal N3 because you would not expect somebody to spend 85% of the night in N3 sleep. So we decided to apply our atypical N3 biomarker to our different neurodegenerative disorder groupings. And what we found was that the Lewy body dementia had about 43% of the subjects had abnormal atypical N3 sleep. And that proportion was significantly greater than the controls or those with RBD. We were also close to significant in the portion of 80 patients who had abnormal atypical N3 sleep. Now, abnormal AN3 is where 4% of the night is characterized as atypical N3. Now, this is an important finding because delirium is provided or has been suggested is a prodromal indicator of dementia with Lewy bodies. And so we believe that this biomarker may help us as we start doing our longitudinal studies to be able to help identify those patients with dementia with Lewy bodies as they transition into more severe symptomology. Now, another thing that we noted is here, I mentioned earlier the work that we had done where we saw the sleep spindle duration increased as we went from the Parkinson spectrums to the non-Parkinson spectrum groupings. And at the same time, the non-REM hypertonia was going down. So in the papers that we published, we've established that abnormal spindle duration, if there's less than or equal to 1 minute in total spindle activity during N2 or N3 sleep across the night, that's considered abnormal. For non-REM hypertonia, if there's more than 5% of sleep time of non-REM hypertonia, that's what we consider abnormal. So what we wanted to do was take all of these subjects that we had, all the patients that we had, and characterize them as either having normal spindle duration and normal non-REM hypertonia. That's what we call normal, abnormal spindle duration with normal non-REM hypertonia, or normal or abnormal spindle duration with abnormal non-REM hypertonia. So we wanted to create these four orthogonal classifications because the two variables were very, very loosely negatively correlated, about negative 0.21. It was significant, but not very strong. So we believe these two biomarkers are relatively independent. Here, what we're looking at is over 55% of the controls had normal spindle duration and normal non-REM hypertonia, and another 30% had abnormal spindle duration, but normal non-REM hypertonia. And both of these proportions were significantly greater than the two characterizations that required abnormal non-REM hypertonia. Conversely, if we look at the Lewy body dementia, we can see that abnormal spindle duration and abnormal non-REM hypertonia occurred in over 75% of the cases, and it was significantly greater than the other three groups combined. So again, the concept is we can look at either or being excessively high or low and use that information to now characterize across groups. So here first we're looking at if spindle duration is normal and non-REM hypertonia is normal, we see that the healthy controls, the control group, but also the mild cognitive impairment and the ADs has significantly greater proportions as compared to the DLBs and the progressive supranuclear palsies. We also see that the REM sleep behavior disorder group, the RBD group, had significantly fewer normal than the control group. The next one, the opposite extreme, was abnormal spindle duration and abnormal non-REM hypertonia. And it's almost a mirror image where we see that the PSPs and the DLBs are significantly greater, the proportions, than all of the other groups. But we also see that the RBD group has a significantly greater proportion that are abnormal compared to the control group. And when we look at the abnormal spindle duration and normal non-REM hypertonia, this group is primarily characterized by the ADs, where those that have abnormal spindles but normal non-REM hypertonia are significantly greater than the DLB and PSP, but also the RBDs. And finally, if we look at normal spindle duration and abnormal non-REM hypertonia, this is primarily the RBD group. But we do believe that here is this is the PD category, and we believe that because we only have 16 cases so far, we believe that this will also become significant as compared to the control group as we increase our sample size. Now, the couple last elements of my talk today. One is the research that we've done on sleep and neurodegenerative disease, specifically sleep position. Now, this was the first finding that we reported out of our National Institute of Aging grant. It was back when we had a small number of cases. We had 24 with mild cognitive impairment, 15 with Alzheimer's disease dementia, and 6 with dementia with Lewy body. We loaded all of the sleep variables into a discriminant function to identify what sleep characteristics could discriminate those with the neurodegenerative disorder from those with controls, meaning those that had an MMSE score greater than or equal to 28. And the primary variable, the most significant variable, was sleep time in the supine position. That very much surprised us. At the time, we only had 40 controls. So we worked with Washington University and used controls that they had for their ongoing research. And so we ended up with 120 total controls that we used for this analysis. And when we did the multivariate logistic regression, we found that greater than 2 hours of supine sleep was associated with this neurodegenerative disease group, independent of sleep apnea, age, gender, and snoring. We also found that there were similar amounts of position changes over the night. So there wasn't something to do with the neurodegenerative disorder that might have decreased movement during the night to be a factor. In any case, what we found was that more than 2 hours of supine sleep was strongly associated with neurodegenerative disorders with an odds ratio of 3.7. Now, in preparation for this talk, I went back since we now have quite a few more DLBs, and I merged the DLBs and the PDs together for this group, and here are the ADs. And again, we're looking at the proportion of each of these patient populations that spent greater than 2 hours in the supine position during sleep, and we can see that both of those are significantly greater than the control group. So our hope is, as we do more longitudinal investigations that include this control group, we'll see if this extended supine sleep may also affect these patients or these subjects over time. Now, again, supine sleep, neurodegenerative disease, it seems a little bit abstract. And so one of the things we wanted to do is bring forward some of the research in the area in trying to support our finding. So the first thing, Lee and colleagues back in 2015 looked at and imaged the clearance from the glymphatic system in rats. And what they found was that the glymphatic clearance of the neurotoxins from the brain was stronger and more efficient when those rats were lateral left or lateral right than they were in the supine position. There was a group in Poland after we published our paper, which was the first that associated supine sleep and neurodegeneration in humans. They did an imaging study using sonography, and what they were looking at was the collapse or the non-collapse, if you would, of the left and right internal jugular. So when you're lateral right, the left internal jugular is above the heart and there's a partial collapse. When you're lateral left, the left internal jugular is below the heart and there is not a partial collapse. Conversely, the right internal jugular is partially collapsed when you're lateral left. What they found, though, is in the supine position, both the left and the right internal jugular are wide open. So they put forward a premise that is, in the lateral positions, this partial collapse of the internal jugular that is above the heart creates flow resistance that optimizes glymphatic clearance. So we believe this is an interesting area for research going forward, especially because it would be relatively easy to keep people from sleeping supine if, in fact, that had some impact on future neurodegeneration. I also want to cover briefly, before this talk is over, a few of our new initiatives. So the first is work that we're doing. This non-REM hypertonia, I'm asked all the time, well, is it associated with REM sleep without atonia? We believe it is. We have seen cases about 80% of the time when clinicians identify that somebody has REM behavior disorder based on REM sleep without atonia, we identify abnormal non-REM hypertonia. So one of the things we're doing with our algorithms is we're developing the capability of automatically detecting phasic, tonic, and mixed REM sleep without atonia. And we've expanded the capabilities of Sleep Profiler to now also be able to measure from the arm as well as the chin. And we're also, as part of this development, we're doing things like these red stripes mean we're identifying events, but we're excluding them because it is occurring during a cortical arousal. We're also excluding events that are occurring underneath snores with the capability of the technician to be able to override these rejections if they believe that they're valid. But the goal is to try and exclude those EMG excursions that may be respiratory related. Another area of our research is combining the sleep biomarkers with biomarkers that our company is developing for waking state EEG. And in fact, all of our National Institute of Aging grants were based on the premise that we can do better at differentiating somebody who's likely to have Alzheimer's disease from Lewy body dementia if we can combine what the EEG looks like during waking state versus what's going on during sleep. So because EEG slowing increased theta activity without increased delta activity is a common characteristic of Alzheimer's disease, we went and looked at the theta alpha ratio during sleep and the theta alpha ratio during eyes closed. And both of these are from the frontalis region. So this is the sleep profiler from AF7 to AF8. This is from 1020 EEG, FP1, FP2. Now, if there is slowing, then the theta power should be greater than the alpha power, and then the ratio increases. So here you can see during sleep, a nice tight consolidation around the controls, that the mean shifts up based on these box and whiskers for MCI, and then even more so with the AD, where the theta alpha ratios are significantly lower in the control versus the MCIs or the ADs. During eyes closed, there's a bit more scatter, and we only see significant differences in the theta alpha ratios between the controls and the Alzheimer's group. But we do see a very nice correlation between the theta alpha during sleep and wake. And this is just an example of the work that we're doing where we're combining the sleep and the wake in order to add to the biomarkers that I had expressed and showed you earlier. And finally, it's taken us almost 8 years, but we're just bringing to market a technology that takes from the sleep profiler and transmits to Bluetooth to a tablet where we're now able to stage sleep in real time. Nobody's ever done this before. Staging sleep in real time, taking our offline algorithms, there's about a 35 to 40 second delay to process and wait for the end of the epoch in order to filter it before we can present it on the screen. And generally what we do is we present the EEG for a full 30 seconds until the next stage comes up. And we also take, because it's so important to be able to see the theta delta power, especially if there's sepsis-associated encephalopathy. And what we showed you earlier on how you can look at the sigma power, for example, on when that would be normal in 3 sleep. So we have developed the capability of presenting the power spectral characteristics. And here you can present them up to 2 hours. And so you can independently flip back through the file, seeing the staging that was called at different time scales. So you can imagine if you were doing rounds looking at patients who were asleep or were supposed to be asleep in an intensive care unit, you could flip back fairly easily through the night, looking for possible periods with sepsis-associated encephalopathy, non-convulsive seizure activity, and so on. This is a recording just of an individual who was hospitalized for a stroke. They had identified and thought maybe he had hypoactive delirium, but they went ahead and discharged him to a skilled nursing facility to begin a stroke rehab. At the skilled nursing facility, multiple people there identified that he might be having an infection, but nobody did anything about it. And in fact, he was then rushed back to the emergency room and shortly thereafter passed away. If they had had this tool, they might have been able to detect the sepsis-associated encephalopathy, and maybe they would have recognized the hypoactive delirium. Or if they had this technology at the skilled nursing facility, they could have identified the risk of sepsis, ran the test, and gotten them back to the hospital. Those ideas are what we're doing with our partners, both at Mount Sinai and Charity in Berlin, where we're using this capability of looking at the sleep and the sleep characteristics and these biomarkers in real time to see if there's ways that we can identify an assessment for delirium or assessment or sepsis as a way to improve outcomes. The last thing we're doing, we have these great biomarkers. I just showed you how they're going to be able to help us in being able to identify different types of neurodegenerative disorders. The question is the general public, are they ready? Do they want something like this? Would they want to know if they were at risk? So back last fall, Mayo Clinic published a study where they surveyed patients who had been diagnosed with REM sleep behavior disorder, and then they were counseled about the REM sleep behavior disorder and its risk as a prodromal indicator or a marker for Parkinson's disease and Parkinson's disease dementia. So they asked the patients a number of questions about that. What we wanted to do in a way to be able to add on or extend that research is we took their questions and adjusted them ever so slightly so they became something of a hypothetical question for somebody that if you were identified with a neurodegenerative disorder, or would you want to be identified with a neurodegenerative disorder? So we acquired data using the survey from 26 individuals who were at a retirement living community and another 34 from the Carlsbad Rotary. And these were before presentations that we made on sleep and neurodegenerative disorders. And then what we did was we matched up their responses to what the Mayo Clinic group got out of their RBD patients. So just a couple just to highlight what this means. So for example, it is important to know my risk for neurodegenerative disease, even if nothing currently can be done to prevent or cure it. On average, 87% of the people responded favorably, and yes, they want to know. And why is that? Because for the most part, they're saying it will help them plan for the future. Again, the vast majority of those want to know if they're at risk. Why? Because they can plan the rest of their lives. There was a strong need and interest of wanting to learn more about medications and adaptive therapies that could delay the neurodegenerative disorder onset. So we believe that there's an opportunity here for sleep medicine professionals to get in, to help, to coach, and also to reduce some of the anxiety that can occur of being diagnosed with the prodromal marker and not knowing when onset might occur. That's something that through our longitudinal research, we hope to help identify speed to phenoconversion and try and look at whether you look at changes in the REM sleep without atonia with the non-REM hypertonia or this atypical N3 sleep and being able to use that information and changes to look and identify severity. So finally, I want to thank all of our collaborators and my colleagues at ABN. Here are all of our neurodegenerative disorder biomarker colleagues and collaborators, and those that are working on the ICU biomarkers, and all of the wonderful institutions that we've worked with. Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it. And now I'll take any questions that you might have.